have 2 seconds just to set that.
Prepared. Like I
Good evening, Madam Speaker, members of the House. Now, we do not want your vote to be thrown away just because someone else's vote. Now, today I have a few arguments. Firstly, voters being able to operate on their own. Secondly, what would qualify as a generic household and the issues therewith. And thirdly, a person's individual rights concerning sex. Before I get to all of these arguments, I'm going to do some points of independent rebuttal. Now, firstly, either both or none. Now, government's come up here and said that we want either both votes or we don't want any of them. Now, what we see here is there's an intrinsic issue that individuals' rights are being infringed on, because now your vote's not going to qualify because your wife's not going to be voting. Now, this all comes down to democracy, which we're going to touch down on a little later point, but ultimately, each individual should have his own vote. Secondly, realizing the worth of women. Now, what we see currently is that government wants to empower women with this policy. Now, if we look at what's already being done, and we look at the current nature of the situation, we see that women are already being empowered. I'll accept you in a moment. Women are already being empowered. As soon as I get to my positive mental, I'm just going to continue with my rebuttal. We see that women are already being empowered in so many other ways. If you look at the 24% amount of CEOs that are now women, which was not the case 10 years ago. If you look at advertising campaigns, we see that in so many other aspects, women are in fact being empowered, and that's not necessarily going to be necessary to go to this large extent to limit other people's rights, just to empower women to such a little bit extent more. Thirdly, one person's right to represent the entire family. Now, if we look at the essence of democracy, one person is not representing the entire household. Each independent person has their own individual right to go and vote. Yeah. Now, we no longer live in a world, on another point. So, we no longer live in a world where there is a generic man-woman role. If you look at current things, if you look at gay relationships, if you look at men that are living on their own, that are bachelors, we see that there's no woman role in this. And government has to sober up and realize that ultimately, we're not living in 1940 where you had a standard stock man-woman relationship. So I'll accept you as soon as I get to my positive matter. Now, on that point also, equal rights for everybody. Now, if a person is stuck to their individual roles and they're happy with it, it's fine. If individuals choose that I want to be to a lesser than a man, and that's their choice and they're happy with that, ultimately, they have the right to do that. To do so. Ultimately, it's their choice whether they want to vote or not. Now, I'm going to go on to my arguments, but before I get to that, I'm going to accept it.
So, why is it that we value democracy and the ability to vote so much?
I believe ultimately that democracy, well, if you look at current voting counts, it's actually shown that we do not realize democracy to a large extent. If you look at the voter turnout, that's as low as 47%. But democracy should be held high because we as citizens are now being able and being allowed to make an active difference in our governing parties, which we did not have, in other political systems. Now, going on to my arguments. Firstly, voters being able to operate on their own, or in fact independently. Now, when one looks at the essence of democracy, and we look at each independent person has their each and own individual rights. Everyone has equal opportunity. Everyone has the choice whether they want to vote or not. And we see that what's happening with this policy is that's being taken away. Individuals are now going to either be forced to vote because their husbands are going to vote. Now they must vote, or we're not going to vote at all because my wife's not going to go. Now, what we see is we're limiting a vote only to households, and only to a limited specific amount of households. And other opinionated people are being left out, which I'll get to later in another argument. Now, this is intrinsically going against the essence of democracy, because the right of each individual person to give their own opinion and give their own vote is not being stand for, is not being shown. on to my second argument. Now, what would qualify as a household? And the flaw is in government's status quo. Now, intrinsically, this is going to inhibit gay marriages, bachelors living on their own, which in many cases, these bachelors are living in high economic areas, busy actively participating and actively increasing the economic flow of things. Don't you believe that these individuals also have the right to vote? John Mark will take you in a moment. What we see is that those individuals, their rights are not going to count. And this is not going to be a true democratic election, because now what we're having is it's not going to be representative of each individual that's going to contribute to its own opinion. I'll accept anything from closing.
So, we are still giving people the ability to vote. What we're telling you is though that when you do go vote, take your wife with you to the booth you're going to go vote.
Now what if I don't have a wife? What if I'm married to another man? What then? Now that was not stated in the policy, and that's an intrinsic flaw in government stuff.
Oh, for shame.
Going on, what we see is that the rights to vote all are now being limited to only households that qualify, and this is not. This does not state the true demographic of the country, and we have an intrinsic issue with it. I will not be accepting any more points. Now, persons' individual rights concerning sex. Now, ultimately, you should not be discriminated or biased because of your race. Because if we look at the way that, if we look at the essence of democracy, everyone should be equal. We want to promote equality. Ultimately, we want everybody to have an equal opportunity to say their say in our democratic arena. What this policy ultimately is doing is it's not allowing this. This is prohibiting. What we see is it's only going to limit it, and with a low voter turnout, as what we have seen already, we're going to be decreasing this even more so. We see ultimately that voters are now going to be limited even to a more extent, because now I'm only going to qualify if I bring along my lady friend. And on that, I'd like to thank everyone, and yeah, thank you.